Hi everybody, and welcome to week 2 of our class. We just wrapped up a week where we were looking at a lot of different tools that archaeologists use. And it's always kind of a fun exploration, to be sure. I wanted to focus this week on a passage in James about having a lot of tools, specifically spiritual ones, knowing the gospel, knowing about God and what he's done for us, and then choosing to walk away and not follow him, and how foolish that would be. But first, I want to just take a peek at archaeological tools that we talked about and share a couple of memories from Megiddo. We talked about topographical maps, right? And finding sites to dig and places things might be. We talked about developing, maps to help us to make sense of what we're finding. We talked about digging up things that we're finding carefully with trowels and, pickaxes, and this girl's carefully pickaxing and brushing. I was at Megiddo, just a couple squares over from me. We talked about the bulk method, and here is a picture of the area of Megiddo that I dug. This is called Area K. It was a residential section, actually, so a lot of these remains were houses. Really exciting to be a part of this dig. We talked about pottery and how important that is to date things. I was fortunate enough to find the first 2 complete forms that year. This was vessel 1 starting to emerge, and just right beside this I found another big pitcher pot, which is really exciting. But we talked about all these different ways of going about archaeology, and the bulk method, and every time an amateur looks at this stuff, so many times it's hard to see through the bulks, right? To see what's actually going on. No, ancients didn't live in little tiny squares like this. We talked about all these tools, and I remember showing up for the first day of this dig. It's excited to get started, right? And we went to the base camp at the bottom of the hill, bottom of the tell, and there were, I think, 6 shipping containers. Or might have been 4. I think there were 6 shipping containers filled to the brim with tools, with pickaxes and shovels and, little hand adzes and, trowels and brushes and buckets and, bags to make these these tops for the bulks, on and on and on, packed to the gills with tools. And whenever I encounter James chapter 1 verse 22 and following, we'll take a look at it in just a moment, I can't help but think of a situation like Megiddo with all those tools, and how foolish it would be for an archaeologist to say, "Oh, wait a minute, I've got a Fisher-Price shovel in my car. Yeah, I've got a little bright green pail. I'm gonna go get that and use all that instead. Let's not use any of these tools, even though this is the right way to go about it." It would make almost as much sense as what we're about to take a look at. Let's take a look at James. This is the passage I want to hone in on, and then the following verse we're going to maybe hone in on just a bit more and spend some extra time there. But he says, be doers, but be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. If anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, He's like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away, and at once forgets what he is like. You know, I'm not sure what image pops in your head when you think of a guy looking intently into a mirror, and then going away and forgetting what he's like. What image that brings to mind? In my mind, I picture a little funny man like Mr. Bean. If you've ever seen any of his comedy, Mr. Bean looking real consternated and intently into the mirror. Say maybe one of his grandkids has drawn all over his face with a Sharpie while he was napping, right? And he's all consternated, looking at all these marks all over his face. And then he turns away and just puts on his business suit and goes away, goes to work. Acts like he's fine, like everything's perfect all day long. It seems foolish to do that, right? I mean, you know what your face was like, but you've forgotten what you saw. That makes almost as much sense as, forgetting that makes almost as much sense as not being a doer, being a hearer only. We can deceive ourselves, but we won't fool others, right? It'll be really obvious to those around us that something's wrong, something's broken. So James is encouraging his audience, and it's kind of neat. He's reaching down thousands of years later to encourage me and to encourage you to follow up, to do what we're hearing and not just be hearers only. Let's take a look at verse 25. But the one who looks into the perfect law, that's an interesting phrase, isn't it? The perfect law, the law of liberty. I think that's really fascinating. And perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts. I like that phrase, the doer who acts. He'll be blessed in his doing. Whenever I run into this phrase law, I start thinking, what are we talking about? Mosaic law? The law of Moses? And I guarantee you, Jews of this time period would have thought Mosaic law was perfect. They would have considered following every jot, every tittle, every precept of that law to be perfect. And tried and tried and tried and tried to follow it. So is that what James is saying here? I don't think so. And, if we look at the rest of James's writings, it becomes clear that he's encouraging us to follow Christ and to follow Jesus. We just, in the previous couple of verses, read about him encouraging us to follow the Word, right? James talking about the Word, him talking about the perfect law here. I think what he's talking about is to follow Christ, right? That new covenant. Let me just write new covenant here. You have to bear with me. Writing with a stylus and not touching the screen is a little bit challenging at times. But I think it's especially enlightening when you look at this next phrase, the law of liberty. I don't think Jews of the first century, while they might have thought Mosaic law was perfect, would ever have described it as liberating or freedom. I think it was pretty strict and pretty stringent pretty hard to follow Mosaic law perfectly. You had different sects of Jews developing, following it different ways and judging each other and trying to follow the law perfectly. I don't think they would have described it as liberty. I think when you talk about the new covenant and Christ, let me just add just that note there. Christ instituted this new covenant. So they're no longer under Mosaic law, the Christians, but they're under this new covenant with God, instituted by Christ. This was the first time Jews or Gentiles even could follow God in perfect obedience, right? This is the first time they could ever perfectly follow God. Because the Old Testament law was never about forgiveness. It was never about actually separating from sin. It was about atonement. I mean, it always carried the weight of next year. They had to come back and 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 come back just to be right with God. When Christ instituted this new covenant, it was the first time people could enjoy perfect liberty, perfect freedom, and freedom from condemnation of the law. And so, I really think James is referring to this new covenant and this idea of perfect obedience to God. And he says, if you persevere in following God, not being a hearer who forgets. You're not a hearer who forgets. But like I say, I love this phrase, the doer who acts. He'll be blessed in his doing. Praise God for that. Those who are following after God are spiritually blessed in the process. Interesting look at not being someone who decides to walk away from the tools, but to use them and implement them in his life. And God promising to bless those who are doing this. I hope you've enjoyed this week and this devotional. Come back next week and we'll look into some other really neat nuggets we can take away. Have a good week, everybody.